The weight of deception. My name is Rebecca Chen, and for 15 years I believed I was living the American dream. At 42, I had what everyone said I should want. A beautiful colonial house in Westchester with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, 2 bright children who excelled in everything from academics to athletics, and a husband who was the envy of every woman at the country club. David Chen was everything a successful man should be. Harvard MBA, senior partner at Goldman Sachs, generous donor to all the right charities, and devoted family man who never missed a school play or soccer game. Or so I thought. The morning that shattered my carefully constructed world began with such mundane normalcy that I sometimes wonder if the universe has a cruel sense of irony. It was a Thursday in March, one of those crisp spring mornings where the daffodils in our garden were just beginning to bloom. I was preparing breakfast while David scrolled through his phone, occasionally grunting at whatever market news was streaming across his screen. Our teenage daughter Emma practiced violin upstairs, the notes of Brahms' violin concerto in D major floating down like a soundtrack to our privileged life. Our son Jake, 14 and perpetually disorganized, was frantically copying math homework at the kitchen counter. The mail had come early that day. Usually, David grabbed it on his way in from his morning run, but he'd skipped exercise to prepare for an important presentation. So it was me who walked down our long driveway, breathing in the smell of fresh mulch the gardeners had laid the day before, completely unaware that my life was about to implode. Among the usual catalogs and charity solicitations was a credit card statement that made me pause. The envelope was addressed to me personally, not to Mr. and Mrs. Chen as our bills usually were. The bank logo was unfamiliar, some institution I'd never heard of. I almost threw it away, assuming it was a marketing ploy or a mistake. David handled all our finances, after all. He was the financial genius who'd turned his modest inheritance into our current fortune, while I was just a former marketing manager who'd struggled with calculus in college. But something made me open it. Perhaps it was the weight of the envelope, suggesting multiple pages inside. Or maybe it was the universe finally throwing me a lifeline after years of drowning in willful ignorance. Whatever the reason, I stood there in our marble-floored foyer and opened a statement that showed a credit card I didn't know existed, in my name, carrying a balance of $47,000. My hands trembled as I scanned the charges. Expensive dinners at Daniel and Le Bernardin on nights when David had claimed to be eating takeout at the office. Hotel charges at the St. Regis and the Plaza during weekends, when he was supposedly at conferences in Boston or D.C. Jewelry purchases from Tiffany's, Cartier and Harry Winston that had never adorned my neck or wrists. The most recent charge, from just 3 days ago, was for a pair of diamond earrings from Tiffany's, $8,500. I remember the exact moment my world tilted off its axis. I was still standing in the foyer, one hand on the doorframe for support, when David called out from the kitchen, "Honey, we're out of that organic marmalade I like." His voice was casual, slightly irritated, the voice of a man who expected his preferences to be anticipated and accommodated. Emma's violin notes soared through a particularly difficult passage she'd been perfecting for months. Jake was asking about soccer practice, whether I could pick him up late because he wanted to work on penalty kicks with his friend Marcus. Everything was so painfully, absurdly normal, while I stood there holding evidence that my entire life was built on a foundation of lies. I walked back to the kitchen slowly, each step feeling like I was moving through water. I tucked the statement into my purse and poured David his coffee. 2 sugars, no cream, exactly how he'd taken it every morning for 15 years. I reminded Jake about his orthodontist appointment. I called up to Emma that she needed to leave for school in 20 minutes. I did all of this while my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. For years, I had accepted so much without question. When David insisted on handling all our finances because numbers weren't my strong suit, I had nodded and felt grateful to be taken care of. He'd presented it as an act of love, taking this burden off my shoulders so I could focus on the children and our home. When he moved his home office to the basement and started locking the door, claiming he needed security for sensitive client information, I never questioned it. When he worked late 4 nights a week, I made excuses to the children and kept dinner warm, never doubting his dedication to providing for our family. The signs had been there, of course. Looking back, they seemed as obvious as billboards along a highway. There was the way he'd suddenly become protective of his phone, taking it with him even to the bathroom. The new cologne he'd started wearing, something expensive and sophisticated that was nothing like the fresh, simple scent I'd bought him for years. The gym membership he'd purchased but never seemed to use, despite leaving the house in workout clothes twice a week. But I had been raised to trust, to see the best in people, especially in the man I'd vowed to love and honor. My mother, who'd passed away 5 years earlier, had always told me that the secret to a happy marriage was choosing to believe the best about your partner. Don't go looking for trouble, she'd say in her gentle way. It has a way of finding you if it's meant to. I had given up my career when Emma was born, at David's insistence. The conversation, if you could call it that, had taken place in this very kitchen when I was 7 months pregnant. I'd just been promoted to senior marketing manager at Ogilvy, and I was mapping out my maternity leave when David announced that no child of his would be raised by strangers. "We don't need your salary," he'd said, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "I make more than enough for all of us. Our children deserve to have their mother at home, not some daycare worker who's watching 15 other kids." I had protested initially. I loved my job, was good at it, had worked hard for that promotion. But David wore me down with a combination of logic and emotional manipulation that I only now recognize for what it was. He talked about the studies showing children of stay-at-home mothers performed better academically. He painted pictures of me being there for every milestone, every school event, every precious moment of our children's lives. He made me feel selfish for wanting to work when we didn't need the money. So I resigned. I told myself it was temporary, just until the kids were in school. But then Jake came along 2 years later, and suddenly I was a 30-year-old woman with a 5-year gap in her resume. My professional contacts had moved on to bigger roles while I was learning the difference between Huggies and Pampers. My MBA gathered dust, metaphorically speaking, as I threw myself into the roles of mother and corporate wife. And I was good at those roles. I organized charity galas that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for causes David's firm supported. I hosted dinner parties that were featured in local lifestyle magazines, each table setting a small work of art, each menu carefully crafted to accommodate every dietary restriction and preference. I volunteered at the children's schools, ran the PTA, organized the annual fundraising auction. I made sure our family looked perfect in every Christmas card photo, coordinated our outfits for corporate events, and mastered the art of small talk about nothing with the other partner's wives. The sacrifices felt worth it because I believed in what we were building together. David provided well for us, and I told myself I was lucky. When my sister Sarah questioned why I never had access to our bank accounts, I brushed off her concerns with practiced explanations about David's expertise and my lack of interest in financial matters. When my old colleague Maria called to invite me to join her new consulting firm, offering a flexible schedule that would work with my family commitments, I declined without even telling David about the offer. Why rock the boat when it was sailing so smoothly? That morning, after the credit card revelation, I said nothing. I drove the kids to school in my BMW SUV, another symbol of our success that now felt like a cage on wheels. Emma chattered about her upcoming recital, whether I thought the blue dress or the black one would be better for performing. Jake complained about his history teacher, Mr. Peterson, who apparently took sadistic pleasure in pop quizzes. I made all the right responses, asked all the right questions, while inside I was screaming. I went to my Pilates class at the club, stretching and strengthening muscles while my world fell apart inside my head. I had lunch with the other members of the hospital auxiliary board, discussing the spring gala theme while I wondered who had worn those diamond earrings. Miranda Ashford commented on how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband, and I smiled and agreed while bile rose in my throat. That afternoon, while David was at work and the children at school, I did something I'd never done before. I went into his locked office. The lock was a simple one, more symbolic than secure, and YouTube provided easy instructions for picking it with a bobby pin. My hands shook as I manipulated the pins, half expecting David to materialize behind me, demanding to know what I was doing. The office was meticulously organized, everything in its place, files labeled with David's precise handwriting. At first, I found nothing unusual. Just client files and market analyses, the detritus of a successful financial career. But I kept looking, driven by a desperate need to either confirm my worst fears or prove myself paranoid. I found what I was looking for in a locked drawer in his desk. This lock was harder to pick, but desperation made me persistent. Inside were more credit card statements, all in my name, from different banks. The total debt across all cards was staggering, over $200,000. There were also bank statements for accounts I'd never seen, showing regular transfers to another account I couldn't trace. But it was the printed emails I found in a folder marked personal that broke me completely. David had been having an affair with a woman named Christine Valdez for at least 3 years. The emails were explicit, not just about their physical relationship, but about their emotional connection, their plans for the future. In one email dated 6 months ago, David wrote about how he was working on an exit strategy from his marriage, how he needed to position things correctly to protect his assets. Rebecca won't know what hit her, he'd written. She's too trusting, too naive. By the time I'm done, she'll be begging me to take whatever I offer, just to make it quick. Christine's responses were equally damning. She called me the first wife, and made jokes about how I was financing their relationship without knowing it. She sent him real estate listings for condos in Manhattan, places where they could start their real life together once he was free. In one email, she mentioned the earrings he'd bought her, how perfectly they matched the necklace from Christmas. I sat on the floor of that office, surrounded by evidence of my husband's betrayal, and cried until I couldn't breathe. Not just for the infidelity, though that cut deep enough. I cried for the woman I had been, the one who had trusted so blindly, who had made herself so small, who had given up so much for someone who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be managed and discarded. But there was more. As I dug deeper, I found documents that showed David had been systematically hiding assets for years. There were properties I didn't know we owned, investments in offshore accounts, a complex web of financial manipulation designed to leave me with nothing when he finally made his move. He'd even taken out life insurance policies on me, with himself as the sole beneficiary. The implications of that last discovery made me physically ill. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the sound of the garage door opening jolted me back to reality. The children were home from school. I quickly photographed everything with my phone, returned the documents to their places, and relocked the drawers. By the time Emma and Jake burst through the door, arguing about something that had happened at lunch, I was in the kitchen, preparing their after-school snacks like any other day. That night, watching David at dinner was surreal. He complained about a difficult client, praised Emma's progress in calculus, and reminded Jake about his upcoming science fair project. He was playing the role of devoted father and husband perfectly, and I wondered how I'd never seen the performance for what it was. When he mentioned he had a client dinner the next night, I nodded and made a mental note to have his dry cleaning ready, all while knowing he was probably planning to see Christine. The next 3 days were torture. I played detective in my own life, following paper trails, making discreet inquiries, building my case. I discovered that Christine Valdez was a 31-year-old account manager at a rival firm, divorced, no children. Her Instagram, which wasn't private, showed a life of luxury that her salary couldn't possibly support: designer bags, expensive dinners, weekend trips to the Hamptons. In many photos, I could see David's reflection in windows or mirrors, his presence hidden but unmistakable once you knew to look. I called my sister Sarah on the third night, after David had left for another client dinner, and the kids were asleep. She drove over immediately, and I told her everything, showing her the photos I'd taken of the documents. Sarah held me while I sobbed, then helped me form a plan. She had a friend from college, Diane Patterson, who was now one of the best divorce attorneys in New York. Sarah made the call that night, explaining the situation, and Diane agreed to see me first thing in the morning. Walking into Diane Patterson's office the next day felt like stepping off a cliff. Her office was on the 40th floor of a Manhattan high-rise, with views that stretched to the Hudson. Diane herself was everything I wasn't. Powerful, confident, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. But her eyes were kind when she listened to my story, and they turned steel hard when I showed her the evidence I'd gathered. "He's been preparing for this divorce for a while," she said, her tone gentle but direct. "The debts in your name, the hidden assets, it's all part of a strategy to leave you with nothing while he walks away with everything. But here's what he didn't count on: you finding out before he was ready. That gives us an advantage." "But I gave up everything for him," I whispered, the injustice of it choking me. "My career, my independence, everything." "And that's exactly what he counted on," Diane replied. But you're not the first woman to be in this position, and you won't be the last. The law recognizes the sacrifices you've made. We're going to document every penny he's hidden, every debt he's fraudulently placed in your name. We're going to make sure you and your children are protected. She outlined a strategy that was both aggressive and careful. We would need to move quickly but quietly, gathering more evidence before David realized I was onto him. She gave me the name of a forensic accountant who specialized in high net worth divorces, and a private investigator who could document David's affair. She also insisted I open my own bank account immediately and start creating a paper trail of my own. He's going to get ugly when he realizes you're fighting back, Diane warned. Men like David don't like losing control. You need to be prepared for him to use every weapon in his arsenal. The children, your reputation, your lack of recent work history. But we'll be ready for all of it. I left her office feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with terror. The hope came from finally having someone on my side who understood what I was facing. The terror came from knowing I was about to blow up my life and had no idea what would be left when the dust settled. The confrontation came 2 weeks later. I'd wanted more time to prepare, but David forced my hand. He came home early one afternoon, which was unusual, and found me in his office. I'd gotten careless, leaving the door unlocked while I searched for a document Diane's forensic accountant needed. The look on his face when he saw me at his computer was one I'd never seen before. Pure cold rage. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was deadly quiet, more frightening than if he'd yelled. I straightened, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "I could ask you the same thing. Christine Valdez, the hidden accounts, the debts you've put in my name. I know everything, David." The mask fell away completely then. The charming husband, the devoted father, the successful provider, all of it crumbled to reveal someone I didn't recognize. His face contorted with contempt as he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You stupid woman," he said, each word dripping with disdain. "You couldn't just leave well enough alone, could you? You had everything. A beautiful home, designer clothes, a life other women would kill for. All you had to do was keep playing your part." "My part?" I stood up, anger overcoming fear. "You mean the role of the obedient wife who doesn't ask questions while you steal from our family and screw your mistress?" He laughed, a harsh sound that made me flinch. "Our family? There is no our anything. Everything in this house, everything you've enjoyed for the past 15 years, is mine. I earned it. You've just been along for the ride, contributing nothing but spending my money and getting fat." The cruelty of his words hit like physical blows, but they also freed me. This was who he really was, who he'd always been beneath the mask. Every loving word, every anniversary gift, every family vacation had been a performance, and I'd been too blind to see it. "I've already seen a lawyer," I said, lifting my chin. "Diane Patterson. Maybe you've heard of her. She's very interested in your financial creativity." His face went white at the mention of Diane's name. She had a reputation for being ruthless in court, especially with men who tried to hide assets from their wives. For the first time since he'd walked in, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. "You think you can fight me?" He recovered quickly, his voice turning menacing. "You have no money of your own, no career, no prospects. You're a 42-year-old woman with a 15-year gap in your resume. What exactly do you think you're going to do? Who's going to hire you? How are you going to support yourself when I'm done with you?" His words hit their mark, voicing every fear that had kept me paralyzed for days. But something in his smugness, his absolute certainty that he had me trapped, ignited a fire I didn't know existed. "I'm going to divorce you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm going to expose every financial manipulation you've committed. I'm going to make sure our children know exactly who their father is. And I'm going to rebuild my life without you." "The children," his laugh was cruel. "You think Emma and Jake are going to choose you over me? I'm the one who pays for Emma's violin lessons with that Russian master. I'm the one who got Jake into that elite soccer camp. They know who provides for this family. They'll see you for what you are, a bitter woman trying to destroy their father out of jealousy." "We'll see about that," I said, though his words about the children terrified me more than anything else. What followed was 6 months of warfare disguised as legal proceedings. David moved out that night, but not before trying to empty our joint accounts. Diane had anticipated this, and had already secured temporary support orders, freezing assets before he could hide them all. He retaliated by canceling my credit cards, including the ones in my name that he'd run up debt on, leaving me unable to buy groceries until Diane got an emergency court order. He tried everything over the following weeks. He alternated between threats and pleas, sometimes in the same conversation. He'd call at 2 a.m, drunk, oscillating between telling me he loved me and describing in detail how he was going to destroy me. He moved in with Christine, but would show up at the house unexpectedly, using his key until I changed the locks. He even had his mother, a woman who'd never liked me, call to beg me to reconsider, talking about the shame of divorce, the damage to the children, how I was destroying the family legacy. But his biggest weapon was exactly what he'd threatened: the children. He began a campaign to turn them against me, taking them on elaborate shopping sprees, promising them cars and trips, telling them that mommy was trying to ruin their lives out of spite. He showed up at Emma's recital with Christine, introducing her to everyone as his friend, while I sat in the back, humiliated, but determined not to make a scene that would embarrass Emma. Jake, younger and more easily swayed, began to parrot his father's words. "Dad says you're being unreasonable," he told me one night. "He says if you really loved us, you'd stop this divorce stuff." The pain of hearing my own son question my love nearly broke me. Emma, older and more perceptive, was harder for David to manipulate. She'd noticed things over the years, she told me one night as we sat in her room. The way her father talked to me, the nights he didn't come home, the credit card that was declined when we were shopping for her prom dress, even though Dad had just bought himself a new Rolex. "I'm not stupid, Mom," she said, her eyes sad beyond her 17 years. "I know Dad's been cheating. I just didn't want to believe it." The legal battles were exhausting. David fought every step, trying to hide assets, claiming the debts were mine, painting me as an unstable woman having a midlife crisis who was unfit to have custody of the children. He brought in character witnesses who testified about what a devoted father he was, how I'd become increasingly erratic and paranoid. Some of these were people I'd considered friends, whose children had played with mine, who'd eaten at our table. Their betrayal was almost as painful as David's. But Diane was brilliant and relentless. The forensic accountant she'd hired uncovered the full extent of David's deception. Not only had he been hiding assets, but he'd been using his position at the firm to funnel money through shell companies. There were offshore accounts in the Caymans, a property in Christine's name purchased with marital funds, and evidence of tax evasion that made the IRS very interested in David Chen. The turning point came when Christine, faced with potential charges for her involvement in hiding assets, decided to cooperate with my legal team. It turned out David had been less than honest with her too, promising to leave his wife years ago, stringing her along while he positioned his finances. Hell hath no fury like a mistress scorned, and Christine's testimony was devastating to David's case. During this time, I began the hard work of rebuilding myself. I started therapy with Dr. Sarah Winters, a woman who specialized in helping women recover from emotional and financial abuse. For the first hour-long session, I could barely speak through my tears. But gradually, I began to understand how I'd been systematically broken down over the years, how David's control had been so gradual, so insidious, that I'd never seen the cage being built around me. "He chose you because you were kind, trusting, and eager to please, Drive," Winters explained. "These aren't weaknesses, Rebecca. They're qualities that make you a good person. He exploited them, but that's about his character, not yours." I also began reaching out to old colleagues, rebuilding professional connections I'd let wither. It was humbling to contact people I'd once worked with as equals, now 15 years behind in my career. But many were more supportive than I'd expected. Maria, who still had that consulting firm, hired me as a part-time contractor, allowing me to work from home while managing the divorce and the children. The work was challenging. Technology had changed, industry standards had evolved, and I felt like a dinosaur trying to catch up. But it was also exhilarating. I'd forgotten how good I was at strategic thinking, how much I enjoyed the challenge of solving marketing problems. Each small success at work built my confidence, proving David wrong about my worthlessness. The hardest part was learning to trust myself again. For so long, I had deferred to David's judgment, accepted his version of reality, believed his assessment of my capabilities. Now, every decision felt monumental. Should I let Jake go to his friend's house when it was David's weekend? Was I being too strict about Emma's curfew, or not strict enough? Was the contractor I hired to fix the roof charging a fair price, or was he taking advantage of a woman alone? But with each decision made, each problem solved, I grew stronger. I learned to research, to ask questions, to trust my instincts. I made mistakes, certainly. I hired a gardener who overcharged and did shoddy work. I let Jake talk me into a video game system that was too violent for his age. But these were my mistakes to make, my lessons to learn. 6 months into the proceedings, David made a fatal error. In his arrogance and desperation, he tried to liquidate some of the hidden assets to fund his mounting legal bills. But the forensic accountant was watching, and the transaction was traced. Suddenly, David was facing not just a divorce, but potential criminal charges for fraud and tax evasion. His lawyer contacted Diane with a settlement offer. David would agree to the divorce terms we'd proposed. I would get the house, primary custody of the children with generous visitation for him, 60% of the disclosed assets, and substantial alimony. In exchange, I wouldn't pursue criminal charges or report his tax evasion to the IRS. I wanted to refuse, to see him prosecuted for everything he'd done. But Diane counseled pragmatism. You could spend years in court and end up with less, she said. Or you can take this offer, get on with your life, and let karma handle the rest. I thought of Emma and Jake, how a criminal trial would affect them, and agreed to the settlement. The day the divorce was finalized, I stood outside the courthouse on a gray December morning, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: freedom. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the steps where other couples were either beginning or ending their marriages. David had already left with his lawyer, not bothering to say goodbye. I watched him get into his Porsche, Christine waiting in the passenger seat, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a blissful emptiness where he used to live in my head. Diane stood beside me, elegant in her cashmere coat. You did well in there, she said. Not all women have the strength to fight back the way you did. I didn't feel strong, I admitted. Most days I felt like I was drowning. That's what strength looks like, she replied. Not feeling fearless, but being afraid and doing it anyway. A year later, my life looked nothing like the one I'd known. The house was the same physical structure, but it felt different, lighter somehow, filled with music and laughter that wasn't performed for anyone's benefit. I'd redecorated, removing all traces of David's austere taste, filling the spaces with color and warmth, and art that I loved even if it wasn't from the right galleries. Emma had been accepted to Juilliard for violin, a dream that had nothing to do with her father's ambitions, and everything to do with her own talent and dedication. She'd chosen to live at home for her first year, she said, to save money, but I knew it was also to be there for me and Jake. The sacrifice humbled me, but she insisted she wanted to be close to family during this transition. Jake had struggled more with the divorce, acting out in school, his grades slipping. But therapy was helping, and he was beginning to understand that his parents' problems weren't his fault or his to fix. He'd quit the elite soccer team, deciding he'd rather play for fun with his friends than deal with the pressure of competing at that level. David was furious, but I supported Jake's decision. It was his life to live. My consulting work had grown into a full-time position with Maria's firm. I wasn't making anything close to what David earned, but it was mine, earned with my own skills and effort. I'd even been promoted to account director, managing a team of younger consultants who had no idea that their boss had once been too intimidated to balance her own checkbook. Dating was a minefield I wasn't ready to navigate fully, but I'd been on a few coffee dates, mostly to prove to myself that I could. The first man I met through a dating app spent the entire time talking about his ex-wife, which was actually comforting in a strange way. It reminded me that I wasn't the only one rebuilding after betrayal. The second was nice but boring, and I realized with delight that I was allowed to be discriminating, to have standards beyond doesn't actively lie to me. More importantly, I was learning to be alone without being lonely. Friday nights, which used to be about preparing for whatever social obligation David had committed us to, were now mine. Sometimes Emma and I would watch movies, critiquing the plot holes and eating popcorn in our pajamas. Sometimes I'd read a book in the bath with a glass of wine, no one timing how long I'd been in there or complaining about the water bill. I rediscovered interests David had mocked or dismissed. I joined a hiking club, despite his voice in my head saying I was too clumsy for outdoor activities. I took a pottery class, creating lopsided bowls that made me ridiculously happy. I traveled to places David had never wanted to visit. A yoga retreat in Costa Rica, a solo trip to Prague, a girlfriend's weekend in Napa where we drank too much wine and laughed until we cried. The woman I saw in the mirror was different too. Not younger or prettier by conventional standards, but more authentic. I'd stopped dyeing my hair the honey blonde David preferred, letting my natural dark color grow in with its threads of silver. I wore clothes that made me feel good, rather than ones designed to make me invisible at corporate events. The lines around my eyes were from genuine laughter now, not forced smiles at David's colleagues' terrible jokes. David remarried quickly to Christine in a lavish ceremony in the Hamptons that was featured in the society pages. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the marriage was already rocky, that Christine was discovering the same controlling nature I'd endured for years. She'd called me once, 6 months after their wedding, crying and asking if David had always been so critical, so cold when he didn't get his way. I felt a twinge of sympathy for her, but mostly I felt grateful for my escape. He love-bombed you in the beginning, didn't he? I asked her. Made you feel like the most special woman in the world. Yes, she whispered, but now you're seeing who he really is, I finished. I'm sorry you're going through this, Christine. I really am, but I can't be the one to help you. You need to find your own way out. I hung up feeling sad for her, but also vindicated. It wasn't me. It had never been me. David was who he was, and he'd do the same thing to any woman who let him. 2 years after that morning with the credit card statement, I was preparing breakfast again. It was another Thursday, this one in September, with light streaming through the kitchen windows I'd had enlarged during the renovation. Emma was home from Juilliard for a long weekend, regaling me with stories about her eccentric composition professor. Jake was showing me a video on his phone, something about a skateboarding dog that had us both laughing until our sides hurt. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria about a potential new client, a startup that would be a significant challenge, but also an exciting opportunity. 2 years ago, I would have doubted my ability to handle it, would have heard David's voice telling me I wasn't smart enough, strategic enough, good enough. Now I simply smiled and typed back, send me the brief. I'll put together a pitch deck this weekend. The doorbell rang and Jake ran to answer it, returning with a package. It's for you, Mom, he said, handing me a padded envelope. Inside was a book, Financial Literacy for Women Starting Over. The note attached was from Diane Patterson. Rebecca, it read, I'm sending this to all my former clients who've successfully rebuilt their lives. Your story inspired me to write it. Thank you for reminding me why I do this work. Diane. I flipped through the pages, seeing chapters on budgeting, investing, understanding credit, all the things I'd had to learn the hard way. But it was the dedication that made me cry. For all the women who were told they weren't smart enough to understand money, and proved everyone wrong. Emma hugged me when she saw my tears. You okay, Mom? More than okay, I told her, meaning it completely. The journey from that shattering morning to this peaceful one had been brutal. There were days I wanted to give up. Nights I cried until dawn, moments when David's voice in my head telling me I was nothing almost won. The financial struggles were real. Learning to budget on a third of what we'd had before, saying no to things the kids wanted, selling jewelry to pay for Emma's violin lessons when David was late with support payments again. But I had survived. More than that, I had thrived. I learned that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. I no longer hated David for what he'd done. I was grateful in a strange way that his betrayal had been so complete, so undeniable, that I'd had no choice but to leave. A smaller betrayal might have kept me trapped forever, making excuses, accepting crumbs, slowly disappearing into the shadow of someone else's life. Standing in my kitchen that morning, I thought about the women still trapped in similar situations. The ones making excuses for controlling partners, giving up pieces of themselves for the promise of security, believing they weren't capable of more. I wished I could tell them what I'd learned, that the security was an illusion, that they were already enough, that the pain of staying would ultimately exceed the pain of leaving. But I also knew that everyone had to find their own moment of clarity, their own credit card statement that changed everything. All I could do was live my truth, be visible in my recovery, and hope that my story might help someone else recognize their own worth before they spent 15 years forgetting it. The sun climbed higher, and the day stretched before me full of possibility. I had client meetings, a lunch date with Sarah to plan our mother's memorial scholarship fund, Emma's performance at a local venue in the evening. Simple things, but they were mine, chosen by me, shaped by my priorities and desires. It was a smaller life in some ways than the one I'm lived as David's wife, but it was also infinitely larger because it was authentic. I poured myself a cup of coffee, added the real cream David had always said would make me fat, and took a moment to savor the simple pleasure of drinking it exactly how I liked it. Such a small thing, but it represented everything. The freedom to choose, the right to take up space, the joy of being unapologetically myself. Jake had gotten up early to work on a history project, something about the Industrial Revolution that actually interested him now that he wasn't under pressure to be perfect. He'd spread his materials across the dining room table, empty cereal bowl pushed to one side, completely absorbed in his research. This was the child David had tried to mold into a mini version of himself, all ambition and sharp edges. Instead, Jake was becoming his own person, thoughtful, curious, kind in ways that reminded me of my father. Mom, did you know that some of the factory workers in the 1800s were kids my age? He asked, looking up with horrified fascination. They worked like 14 hours a day. I did know that, I said, sitting down beside him. It's one of the reasons we have child labor laws now. People fought hard for those protections. That's messed up, he said, then added thoughtfully, I guess I'm pretty lucky, huh? I mean, my biggest problem is deciding which video game to play after school. I ruffled his hair, marveling at his growing awareness of the world beyond our privileged bubble. David would have turned this into a lecture about how Jake needed to work harder to maintain our social position. I just smiled and said, yes, you're lucky. We both are, but being lucky comes with responsibility to help others who aren't. Is that why you do that pro bono work for the women's shelter? He asked. Partly, I admitted. After my divorce, I'd started volunteering my marketing skills for a local women's shelter, helping them with fundraising campaigns and social media strategy. It was my way of giving back, of helping other women who were where I'd been, but also because it makes me feel good to help. Selfish altruism, you might call it. Jake grinned. Cool. Maybe I could volunteer there too. Like teach computer skills or something? My heart swelled. I think they'd love that. I'll ask the director. Emma wandered in, still in her pajamas despite it being nearly noon. College life had shifted her sleep schedule dramatically. Is there coffee? She asked hopefully. Always, I said, getting up to pour her a cup. How was the practice session last night? She groaned dramatically. Intense, but good intense. My professor thinks I might be ready to audition for the Philharmonic's Young Artist program. Emma, that's amazing, I exclaimed, genuinely thrilled. This was her dream, her achievement, nothing to do with anybody's expectations but her own. It's just an audition, she said, but her eyes were bright with excitement. Probably won't get it. The competition is insane. You'll never know unless you try, I said, echoing advice my mother had given me years ago, advice I'd forgotten during my marriage. And even if you don't get it this time, the experience will be valuable. She nodded, then said quietly, Dad called yesterday. He wants me to have dinner with him and Christine next week. Just me, not Jake. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I felt the familiar twist of protectiveness. How do you feel about that? I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to maintain some relationship with him. He's still my father. But part of me is so angry about everything he put you through. Put us through. You don't have to decide based on my feelings, I told her, meaning it. Your relationship with your father is yours to define. If you want to have dinner with him, go. If you don't. Either way, I support you. She looked relieved. Thanks, Mom. I think I'll go, but on my terms. Somewhere public, just for an hour. Baby steps, you know? Baby steps are still steps forward, I agreed. My phone rang, Maria's name flashing on the screen. Sorry, I need to take this, I said, stepping into the living room. Rebecca, I know it's Saturday, but I have a situation, Maria said without preamble. Remember that nonprofit we pitched to last month? They want to hire us, but they want to meet with the full team Monday morning, including you. That's wonderful, I said, then processed the rest. Wait, including me? But I'm usually behind the scenes on this account. Not anymore, Maria said firmly. The executive director specifically asked for you to be there. Apparently, your ideas on their rebranding really resonated. This is your chance to step into a more visible role, Rebecca. You ready for it? A year ago, I would have panicked, would have found excuses why someone else should go instead. Now, I just took a deep breath and said, I'll be ready. Send me the materials to review this weekend. After I hung up, I stood in my living room, looking around at the space I'd reclaimed and made my own. The walls were painted a warm sage green instead of David's preferred stark white. The art was an eclectic mix of pieces I loved, an abstract painting I'd bought from a street artist in Prague, photographs from my travels, Emma's first violin hung on the wall like the treasure it was. The furniture was comfortable and inviting, chosen for how it made me feel, rather than what it would convey to guests. On the mantel was a photo from Jake's 15th birthday party last month. It was just the three of us at a hibachi restaurant, laughing as the chef flipped shrimp into Jake's mouth. David had been invited, but hadn't shown, claiming a work emergency. The old me would have made excuses for him, would have tried to fill the gap of his absence. Instead, we'd had a wonderful time without him, creating our own traditions, our own memories. Next to that photo was one of Sarah and me from our Napa trip, sunburned and giddy, holding up wine glasses and a toast. Sarah had been my rock through everything, never saying, "I told you so," even though she'd seen through David years before I had. Our relationship had deepened through this trial, becoming less about obligatory sibling connection and more about genuine friendship. The doorbell rang again, and this time it was my neighbor, Linda Morrison. She was holding a casserole dish and looking uncharacteristically nervous. Linda and her husband Ted had been friends with David and me for years, part of our social circle. After the divorce, most of those friendships had evaporated, people choosing sides or simply finding it too awkward to maintain relationships with both of us. "Rebecca," she said hesitantly, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to bring you this and to apologize." I invited her in, curious. Linda had testified as a character witness for David during the divorce, talking about what a devoted family man he was. It had stung, especially since she'd been at my house countless times, had seen the dynamics of our marriage up close. "Apologize for what?" I asked, though I knew. She set the casserole on my kitchen counter and turned to face me, tears in her eyes. "For not seeing, for not believing you, for testifying for David." The words came out in a rush. "Ted and we're getting divorced. I found out he's been having an affair with his assistant for 2 years. And suddenly I understood what you went through. How someone can show one face to the world and another at home. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I was a terrible friend. I could have been petty, could have pointed out the irony, made her feel worse. But I'd learned that holding on to anger only poisoned the person carrying it. Instead, I made us both tea and listened as Linda poured out her story, so similar to mine in many ways. Another woman who'd given up her career, who'd trusted too much, who'd been blindsided by betrayal. "The worst part," Linda said, clutching her mug, "is that everyone thinks I'm crazy. Ted's been telling people I'm having a midlife crisis, that I'm imagining things." "Sound familiar?" "Painfully familiar," I admitted. "But Linda, you're not crazy. Trust your instincts. And get a good lawyer. I can give you Diane's number if you'd like." She nodded gratefully. "How did you do it? How did you rebuild?" "I'm 53 years old. I haven't worked in 20 years. I don't even know who I am without Ted." "You start small," I told her. "One day at a time, one decision at a time. You make mistakes, you learn, you grow. And eventually, you realize that the person you're becoming is so much better than the person you were allowed to be." After Linda left, promising to call Diane on Monday, I reflected on how far I'd come. 2 years ago, I might have felt vindicated by her situation, might have thrown her betrayal during the divorce back in her face. But I'd learned that other women weren't my enemy, even when they'd stood against me. We were all just trying to survive in a world that often pitted us against each other. That evening, we went to Emma's performance at a small venue in the city. It was a showcase for emerging artists. Nothing like the grand concert halls David had always envisioned for her. But watching my daughter on that small stage, playing with a passion and joy that came from within rather than from external pressure, I felt prouder than I'd ever been. Jake sat beside me, actually putting his phone away to listen to his sister play. "She's really good," he whispered, sounding surprised and impressed in the way only a younger sibling could. "She really is," I agreed. After her set, Emma joined us in the audience to watch the other performers. A young man with a guitar sang songs about heartbreak and redemption that hit a little too close to home. But instead of making me sad, they made me feel connected to something larger than my own story. Everyone in that room had faced pain, had survived something, had chosen to transform it into art. "Thank you for coming," Emma said, squeezing my hand. "I know Dad thinks this is all a waste of time, but your father's opinions about your music don't matter anymore." I interrupted gently. "What matters is how it makes you feel, what it means to you." She nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. "It makes me feel alive," she said simply. On the drive home, Jake fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from actually waking up before noon on a weekend. Emma sat in the front, talking about her classes, her friends, a boy she might be interested in but wasn't sure. Normal mother-daughter conversation that felt like a gift after everything we'd been through. "Mom," she said as we pulled into our driveway, "I'm proud of you. For leaving Dad, for starting over, for showing me that women don't have to accept less than they deserve. I just wanted you to know that. I had to sit in the car for a moment after she went inside, overwhelmed by her words. All the pain, all the struggle, all the fear had been worth it for this. Raising a daughter who knew her worth from the start, who wouldn't spend 15 years learning what I'd had to learn the hard way. That night I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety or fear, but from a kind of restless energy I'd been feeling lately. I went to my home office, a space that had once been David's gym, now converted into my sanctuary. The walls were covered with inspiration boards for various clients, sticky notes with ideas, photos from successful campaigns I'd worked on. I opened my laptop and began writing, not for a client, but for myself. The words poured out, my story, our story, the story of every woman who'd ever been told she wasn't enough. I wrote about the gaslighting, the financial abuse, the slow erosion of self that happens so gradually you don't notice until you're drowning. But I also wrote about the recovery, the rebuilding, the fierce joy of discovering who you are when no one's telling you who to be. By dawn, I had 20 pages. The beginning of something. Maybe a blog, maybe a book, maybe just catharsis. But it felt important, like something I needed to say, even if no one ever read it. Monday's meeting with the nonprofit went better than I could have imagined. I presented our rebranding strategy with confidence, fielding questions and offering solutions with an ease that surprised me. The executive director, a woman named Patricia who'd built the organization from nothing after her own divorce, pulled me aside afterward. I specifically wanted you on this project, she said, because I researched your background. I know what you've been through. And I think that perspective, that understanding of starting over, is exactly what our organization needs. Driving back to the office, I thought about how my greatest shame had become my greatest strength. The very experience David had thought would break me had instead given me insight, empathy, and resilience that made me better at my job, better at life. That afternoon, an email popped up from an unknown address. The subject line made my heart stop. I need help. It was from Christine, David's wife. Ex-wife, apparently. The email was long, rambling, desperate. David had left her for another woman, someone even younger, but not before running up debts in her name, hiding assets, playing the same games he'd played with me. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, she wrote, but I don't know where else to turn. He's trying to destroy me the way he tried to destroy you. Except I don't have children with him, don't have the legal protections you had. I'm drowning. I stared at that email for a long time. This woman had been my enemy, the symbol of my betrayal, the reason my marriage had ended. Except that wasn't true, was it? David was the reason my marriage ended. Christine had just been another woman he'd used and discarded. I forwarded her Diane's contact information with a brief note. She's the best. Tell her I sent you. And Christine, you're stronger than you think. You'll survive this. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close to it. A recognition that we were all just trying to find love and security in a world that often weaponized those needs against us. That night, Jake had friends over for a study group that turned into a video game tournament. The house was full of teenage boys eating everything in sight and yelling at the TV. A few years ago, this would have stressed me out, worried about the noise, the mess, what the neighbors would think. Now I just made more popcorn and enjoyed the sound of my son being a normal, happy teenager. Emma came home from classes to find the chaos and immediately retreated to her room, but not before grabbing some snacks and giving me a commiserating eye roll. Boys, she muttered, making me laugh. You were a teenage boy once too, I called after her. I distinctly remember you and your friends having a karaoke marathon that lasted until 3 a.m. That was different, she called back. We had talent. The easy banter, the comfortable chaos, the lived-in feeling of our home. This was what I'd gained by losing my marriage. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Not a performance, but an authentic existence where we could all be ourselves, flaws and all. Later that week, I had my regular therapy appointment with Dr. Winters. We'd moved from weekly to monthly sessions, a sign of progress that made me proud. But I still found them valuable. A chance to check in with myself, to process new challenges as they arose. How are you feeling about Emma's relationship with her father? Dr. Winters asked, after I told her about the dinner invitation. Protective, I admitted, but also, resigned. I can't control their relationship. I can only control how I respond to it. That's a very healthy perspective, she noted. And how about you? Any anxiety about David trying to manipulate the children against you? He already tried that, I said. It didn't work. They're old enough to see him for who he is. And I think he's too busy with his own drama to focus on making mine worse. Christine divorcing him, the IRS still investigating his tax issues, his reputation at work suffering. He's got bigger problems than trying to hurt me. How does that make you feel? Seeing him face consequences? I thought about it. Not as satisfied as I thought it would. Mostly I just feel distant from it all, like hearing about troubles in a stranger's life. Is that normal? It's healthy, Drive. Winters assured me. It means you've truly moved on. You've built a life that doesn't revolve around him, even in opposition to him. That's real freedom. Real freedom. The words echoed in my mind as I drove home. Freedom to make my own choices, my own mistakes. Freedom to fail without someone cataloging my failures as evidence of my inadequacy. Freedom to succeed without someone diminishing my achievements to prop up their own ego. That weekend, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I went on an actual date. Not just coffee, but dinner with Michael, a widower I'd met at a grief support group I'd attended to deal with the death of my marriage. He was kind, funny, and refreshingly honest about his own struggles with starting over. I keep forgetting she's gone, he admitted over pasta. I'll see something funny and think, I have to tell Sharon about this, and then remember I can't. Does that ever stop? I don't know about grief from death, I said carefully, but grief from divorce. It fades. You stop expecting them to be there. And eventually, you're grateful for the space they left behind, because it lets you become who you were meant to be. He smiled sadly. I hope you're right. Some days I feel like I'm just going through the motions. The motions are enough sometimes, I told him. Eventually, they become real movements again. It wasn't a love connection, we both knew that. But it was connection, human to human, two people who understood loss and the slow process of rebuilding. We parted with a hug and a promise to have dinner again sometime, as friends. The next morning brought a surprise. David called, the first time he'd contacted me directly in months. Usually, all communication went through lawyers or was about the children. But this time, his voice was different. Older, tired, defeated. Rebecca, he said, I know I have no right to ask, but I need a favor. I almost hung up. Almost. But curiosity won. What kind of favor? The IRS is freezing my accounts while they investigate. I need to borrow money for Jake's soccer camp. I know I'm supposed to pay for it. I want to pay for it. But right now, I literally can't access my funds. The irony was delicious. The man who'd controlled every penny, who'd told me I was too stupid to understand finance, was calling me for money. The old Rebecca would have panicked, would have figured out how to help despite everything. The new Rebecca just felt calm. Jake quit elite soccer, I informed him. He's playing in the local league now. The fees are $200, not $2,000. And I already paid them. He quit, but he had such potential. He has potential to be happy, I interrupted. That's all that matters to me. There was silence on the line, then a bitter laugh. You've changed. Yes, I agreed. I have. Goodbye, David. I hung up feeling no satisfaction, no vindication, just a quiet peace. He was Jake and Emma's father. That would never change. But he was no longer my problem, no longer the voice in my head telling me I wasn't enough. That afternoon, I worked on my writing project, which had grown to over 100 pages. Sarah had read some of it and encouraged me to seek publication. Other women need to hear this, she'd said. They need to know they're not alone, that there's life after betrayal. I wasn't sure about publication, but I kept writing anyway. It was therapeutic, transformative, turning my pain into something that might help others. Each word was a small act of rebellion against the silence that had kept me trapped for so long. As I wrote, Emma practiced violin upstairs, the music floating down like a blessing. Jake was at his friend's house, working on a robotics project for the science fair. Not because he had to be the best, but because he genuinely enjoyed it. My children were becoming themselves, not extensions of their father's ego or mirrors of his ambition. The doorbell rang, interrupting my flow. It was a delivery, a small package with no return address. Inside was a jewelry box, and inside that, the diamond earrings. The ones that had started it all. That $8,500 purchase that had opened my eyes. There was a note in Christine's handwriting. These were never mine to keep. Do with them what you will. I held those earrings up to the light, watching them sparkle. They were beautiful, I had to admit, but they were also tainted, symbols of betrayal and deception. I couldn't wear them, couldn't sell them, couldn't even throw them away. They were evidence of a life I'd left behind. Then I had an idea. I called Patricia from the nonprofit. How much would diamond earrings be worth at your silent auction? Depends on the earrings, she said carefully. I described them, mentioned the designer, the estimated value. I could hear her intake of breath. That would be our biggest ticket item. Are you sure? I'm sure, I said, but I want them listed as donated by anonymous. And I want the description to say, these earrings represent transformation. May they bring their new owner joy and fun services for women starting over. It felt right, transforming symbols of betrayal into hope for other women. David's money, filtered through his deception, would end up helping women escape situations like mine. There was poetry in that, justice that went beyond any court ruling. 2 years. It had been 2 years since that morning with the credit card statement. 2 years of lawyers and therapy and rebuilding. 2 years of discovering who Rebecca Chen was when she wasn't trying to be Mrs. David Chen. I was a mother, but not just a mother. A professional, but not defined by my career. A survivor, but not a victim. A woman who drank her coffee with real cream, who painted her walls sage green, who was learning to trust her own judgment again. The weight of deception had nearly crushed me. David's lies, yes, but also my own self-deception. The lies I told myself about what I was willing to accept in exchange for security. But in breaking free from both, I discovered a truth worth everything I'd lost. I was enough. I had always been enough. Standing in my kitchen as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, I felt the full weight of that truth. Not the weight that crushes, but the weight that grounds you, that makes you real and solid and present in your own life. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Just got off the phone with Patricia. She wants to expand our contract. She specifically wants you to lead the project. Congratulations, Director Chen. Director Chen, not Mrs. Chen, not David's wife, not someone's mother. Just me, recognized for my own achievements, my own worth. I smiled, poured myself another cup of coffee with extra cream, and got back to work. My life, my choices, my future. The view from here was beautiful.